For over 10 years, we at Climate One have been engaging policymakers, influencers, entrepreneurs, and activists and scientists in broad, respectful, candid conversations about everything climate. Food, energy, water, technology, transportation, housing. We've had huge success bringing together people who think they're on opposite sides of issues. When they sit down and have a candid conversation, they often find common ground and the basis for real solutions. We're emotional beings. Thoughtful, inclusive conversations create the conditions in which the changes we want to see become possible. So I want to hear from you. When you talk about climate, how do you talk about it? More importantly, what do you want to be talking about? With whom? Join the conversation. Even make your own video. Invite your friends to join you. Let's talk climate. Welcome to Climate One Today. We're exploring the connection between economic class, land conservation and land use, and access to nature in the American West. Politically conservative hunters and anglers are some of the biggest funders of efforts to conserve ecosystems around the country. Some of those donors fly their private jets to Aspen, Jackson Hole, and Santa Fe. We'll learn how they relate to the environment and what they are really seeking. We also will explore access to nature in America's cities and how land patterns may change due to COVID-19. First, we'll remember how Native Americans and other people of color are often erased from the stories we tell ourselves. This land is your land rings hollow for many of our fellow Americans. Recording today from Bend, Oregon, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Warm Springs, Wasco, and Paiute Native American tribes who first inhabited these lands. Delighted to welcome three fabulous guests on today's show. Justin Farrell is Associate Professor of Sociology at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He's author of the new book, Billionaire Wilderness, The Ultra-Wealthy and the Remaking of the American West. Dina Gilio Whitaker is a lecturer in American Indian Studies at California University, San Marcos. Author of As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. I should note that Teen Vogue ranked it as one of the top 10 books on climate, even though it's not really about climate. Diane Regas is president and CEO of the Trust for Public Land, one of the country's premier conservation organizations. She previously served as a high-ranking official at the US EPA. Welcome to you all. Welcome to Climate One.
Thanks.
Great to be here.
To have you here. Dina, let's begin with you. There's sort of the mythology of the American West wrapped up in the American story. Many of our iconic national parks, Yellowstone, Glacier, Yosemite, are of course here. Much of America's oil and gas is extracted in the West. What's the real story of the West, from the Pilgrims back to the black snakes of today, such as the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines? Tell us that backstory.
Yeah, we often hear this phrase that America is, or the national parks are America's greatest idea, or something to that effect. And it always begins. This narrative begins with this sort of common sense understanding about the wilderness as the virgin wilderness, a place that was unpeopled. It was these places where only animals roamed, and maybe there were Indians there at one time, but they were like the animals, and they're roaming around on the land, aimlessly. But the reality of that is that Native people have always inhabited these spaces everywhere. Every square inch of of the land on this continent was indigenous territory. They were spaces and lands that Native people used for a variety of purposes. They were, most tribal people were actually farmers. So, to debunk the myth of the wandering nomadic native, this is largely something that's very not really true. There were people, however, that were, you could say, migratory, and they traveled between homelands, between places in what we sometimes call the seasonal round. So there were much like people today have, winter homes and summer homes. Native people had the same kind of land use patterns where they would travel from their winter homes to their summer homes and back, depending on food sources and ceremonial cycles and things like that. So this is what happens with some of these or these national parks, like Yellowstone, like Yosemite and Glacier National Monument, which are the first three that become national parks. And they, the actual history of them is that they were not empty spaces that needed to be preserved, but they were empty spaces that needed to first be created. As Mark David Spence notes in his infamous book, Dispossessing, Dispossessing Wilderness. And so this is part of the larger history of American genocide, land theft, and indigenous dispossession that most people don't really connect with when they think of national parks.
Thank you. Justin Farrell, as a native of Wyoming, you note in your book that you gained access as a white man from the Ivy League that, a person from another background wouldn't have. So how did race and class offer you access into the ultra wealthy in Jackson Hole? You write about the real upper percent there.
Yeah. So historically, there hasn't been a lot of work within the academy on the ultra wealthy, on economic elites, at least from the ground level, from their perspective through interviews or observation. And so in terms of this project, I really played up kind of both aspects of my identity. I do talk about in the introduction of my book how I am a white man. I was able to navigate these spaces almost in an unquestioned way through these private clubs. If I were even walking through the lobby, of the Yellowstone Club or some other elite private clubs, no one was going to stop me and ask me what I was doing there or ask me why I was there. And so I had that an aspect of my identity that allowed me to gain access into these spaces, but also being born in Wyoming, I also have this gravitas that the folks I interviewed often admired and tried to emulate. And so I had this kind of dual identity of this, Yale elite gravitas, and then the Wyoming Western gravitas that ties into these myths of authenticity and masculinity, and was able to kind of pair those together to get the interviews and to get into these spaces.
And Regas, for generations, the Astoria Hot Springs in Jackson were a community gathering area. In the 1990s, they were closed to the public, and a developer planned to convert it to a private spa. What happened next?
Well, what happened was the community didn't like that plan. And in fact, a couple of those developers went bankrupt. And the Trust for Public Land believes that everybody needs access to the outdoors at every economic level, every race, Native people, everybody. We can live longer, healthier, and happier lives if we have access. So the Astoria Hot Springs, which is about halfway between Jackson Hole and Alpine, a city where a lot of the people who work in Jackson live, we figured out who owned it and tracked them down and began to engage the community in what would they like to see at Astoria Hot Springs. And what people wanted was a restoration of a place that they'd had access to as kids. And people who'd immigrated to the area, a lot of the Hispanics who lived around there, live in Alpine, really wanted a place that they could go and recreate with their families. So we had thousands of local people involved in designing what Astoria Hot Springs could look like going forward. It's one of the only hot springs in the country that is now run by a nonprofit, and we're hoping to reopen it. It'll be ready physically this year with provisions to make sure that everybody can have access. So I'm really excited about it and really excited to get to go see it.
And Justin, that really runs against kind of the theme of what you've written about, which is these private enclaves, gated communities, large masses of land sort of preserved for people who own them or their friends. So where's the wealth coming from, and how is it reshaping the American West?
Yeah, it's coming from the shift within the United States and even globally with the increase of wealth among a select few. And so, for example, we've seen a globally a 13% increase just over 1 year in the number of ultra wealthy people. And in the United States, there are more than 100,000 ultra wealthy people now. And that's commonly known in terms of just the wealth concentration and the income inequality that has resulted. But it is nice to hear a story like the story of Hot Springs, that you have this, community collaboration, and you have a nonprofit, getting in touch with the community and building it around their needs, which is very different than, our north in Jackson Hole, which was the topic of my book.
Right, and you write about how the wealthy relate to the environment, and also, there's also you talk about, right, somewhat about the people who live there, who are very making $20,000 a year, and these wealthy people like to pride themselves that they can sit at the cowboy bar, and people don't know that they're a billionaire, and they mingle with regular folk. But what's their approach to the environment and the intersection of race?
Yeah, so I talk about how they use the environment to solve these dilemmas that they face, and there's these economic dilemmas. You've made all this money. How should you enjoy it? How should you give it away? But then there's also the social dilemma, which you're kind of touching on here, in terms of how do they wrestle with and respond to the social stigma of being rich, of feeling like perhaps they're not authentic people, or perhaps for some feeling guilty about having all that wealth. Not all, just some. And that plays into their attraction to these areas, and to the idea that, again, kind of going back to Dina's point, that this is an a preserved Eden, that they can enjoy, they can relax, and they deserve, to relax in, because they've worked so hard to get their wealth. And so what's really interesting is the way it plays out, again, across these race and class lines, the sense that, when you move to a place like that, I write in the book how they're trying to become more authentic people, and they're trying to resolve these existential dilemmas they face as wealthy, as folks who are sometimes targeted in the media and the like. And so they try to form relationships with quote unquote normal people. And oftentimes those relationships are based on economic exchange. So, I did interviews with the working poor, mostly immigrants from Mexico, and asked them, are these really your friends? Do they really care for you? What is your sense of how their environmental ethic and how they, enjoy the environment? And so all this is wrapped up again in race and class, and impacts how they see the natural environment. And then it ultimately impacts their philanthropy, and which organizations they give money to, and the impact that has on the community and the ecosystem.
Diane Regas, the Trust for Public Land, works with community groups and acquires land that hands them over to local control. Do you think that Native Americans, other people of color, traditionally have been left out a lot of those conversations? What does Trust for Public Land try to be inclusive with the people who are around the land now, and as Dina mentioned earlier, may have been related to it or occupied it earlier?
Well, it takes time and care to make sure that we engage the communities. And so we put equity at the center, because equity in the outdoors is absolutely essential, and it's not easy to achieve, I think, for some of the reasons that Justin has pointed to. So we look, is the organization invited into the community? Have we looked at the data and are informed about who's in the community, how to engage them, and are we involving them? And it's really exciting to me to see how when we invite in a genuine way the opportunities for communities to engage with us, with partners, for what they want to see in their community for the outdoors. It's truly transformational. It changes the community, strengthens the community, in addition to providing wonderful opportunities for people to get outdoors. Just one example that here in California, where both Dina and I are right now, the Kashaya band of the Pomo Indians had been kicked off of their historic lands and limited to a very small reservation. And some of their sacred lands, they actually had to get permission to go, whether it was to do traditional food gathering, whether it was to do sacred ceremonies. It's along the coast of Sonoma, which you probably have heard of as a pretty wealthy area. Some of the families that had owned that land allowed the Kashaya to come on, but they had to ask. And so a few years ago, we got the opportunity to work with the tribe and help them create a new Kashaya preserve along the coast, so that for the first time they have ownership and management of that land, first time in 150 years since they were kicked off the land. And to me, for me, it creates a sense of optimism that we can make progress in addressing the very serious issues that communities have with historic inequities, historic lack of access, historic changes in even their access to their most sacred places.
Dina Julia Whitaker, I realized preparing for this program how ignorant I am of Native American history, and I went to some pretty good schools, and I don't know if I blocked it out of my mind because I didn't want to. It was hard to confront those things. But talk to us about the shortcoming in American education. We don't even know like what words to use these days. To is it an Indian, Native American? We're going through that now with Black and African American. So address the educational inadequacies and also what terms we should be using.
Your experience is unfortunately just common. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't matter. You could have, an advanced degree and still not know,
Right.
what the actual history and political structure of this country is relative to American Indians, because it's not taught. And studies actually show that across the board, in all 50 states in the K through 12 level, the teaching of American Indians stops at about 1900. So what that does in effect is render Native people as people of the past, people that no longer exist. And so it's no wonder that when we show, if we do show up in popular culture or in demographic studies and things like that, most of the time we're not there for especially. But when we are painted with these broad brushstrokes of being, not modern people, not and relegated into this frozen past. So, but the important thing to know is that as people, we are not ethnic minorities, right? That's probably the biggest misnomer that we deal with. We are not ethnic minorities. It is not correct to think of us in terms of people of color, as people part of the large brown mass. Like, we are nations. We are people with political relationships to the state because of the treaty relationships. There are over 300 treaties that are still extant, that are still in force because they don't expire. They are made in perpetuity, and that constructs our relationship to the United States, which is usually a thorn in the side of the state, because for them, for the American government, we have always been a problem. The Indian problem is something to be solved. Which they try to do usually by trying to get rid of us in one way or another. So, so we're always fighting against that impulse. We say the impulse of the settler state is to eliminate the native to gain access to our lands, and that is not something that has ended. We see it. We saw it recently with the Trump administration early on in the COVID crisis, with the disestablishment of the Wampanoag Reservation in Massachusetts. So we are still basically under attack. Our lands we are still trying to protect them. And it's probably worth talking about for a minute the fact that yesterday we got this kind of stunning decision from a federal court, ordering the shutdown of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was a 4-year-long legal battle. And
I want to remind you to be careful hitting your computer or microphone if we're hearing that. Sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, so that's just that was a kind of news flash about the Dakota Access Pipeline that they have shut it. The judge ordered for oil to stop flowing as of August 5th, while they do the environmental impact study that was ordered by during the Obama administration and that the Trump administration overturned.
Justin Farrell, Wyoming is one of the biggest energy exporting states in the country. You write about some of the ultra wealthy people there who make their money presumably in finance and hedge funds, et cetera. Did your conversations get into any of the irony of people wanting to preserve Wyoming, but then did you get into the Dakota Access Pipeline, Keystone XL pipeline? The fact that Wyoming tried to basically outlaw renewable energy at one point in 2017, or did people kind of compartmentalize that off, sort of the energy extraction with preserving Eden where they live?
Yeah, it's mostly compartmentalizing, and it was quite shocking to me actually the effectiveness with which they did that. And yeah, you're right. Wyoming is the largest producer of coal and substantial oil, natural gas, and that in a lot of ways has made possible this what I call a tax haven in Wyoming. And it is very lucrative to move there for at least part of the year. They have very loose restrictions on what counts as being a resident. And so you see over time this rush of wealth to that corner of the state. And for example, by 2015, 8 out of every $10 made in Teton County came from investment dividends and just interest rather than a salary from a job. And so the state is able to continue not to have a state income tax, a corporate tax. And so it's a very lucrative place. And you connect that to climate change. And I would ask them about, maybe they worked in finance, or maybe they worked for an oil and gas company, or, were CEO of an oil and gas company. And a lot of the conversations that we would have would kind of move away from these issues that I call buzzkill issues, or issues that might place one in more choppier political waters, because climate change is inherently, a political issue and is going to be resolved at that level. And so, it was really interesting to me to understand and to write about how they kind of navigate all of that in terms of they love the area, they love the pristine ecosystem, and yet climate change is wreaking havoc on that very ecosystem. So it was just difficult for them to kind of even conceptualize and discuss too.
Justin Farrell is Associate Professor of Sociology at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and author of Billionaire Wilderness, The Ultra Wealthy and the Remaking of the American West. Other guests today are Dina Gilio Whitaker, lecturer in American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos, author of As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice, From Colonization to Standing Rock, and Diane Regas, President and CEO of the Trust for Public Land, one of the country's largest land conservancies. When Jessica Newton tried inviting her daughter's friends on family hikes, many of their moms said no way. She realized that not all Black women were as comfortable out in nature as she was. She started a meetup and later an organization called Black Girls Hike. 3 years later, she renamed the group to Vibe Tribe Adventures, and now they go hiking, ziplining, river rafting, and more. They're based in Denver with chapters around the US and a few overseas.
I've always been an outdoorsy girl. Black women, we're already very communal anyways. And so being able to say, hey, Black girls, let's go out and hike. Well, number one, it attracted women who were already outdoorsy. And then I started seeing other women who had never been outdoors. And it was like, hey, I saw you guys, you made a post on Facebook and I just want to try it. There are tons of Black women across the globe who want to get outdoors, but they may not have the education on how to be outdoors. They may not have the resources to get outdoors, and there's a fear of wilderness. We did have an incident where we went hiking and the state patrol, park rangers, and the border directors were called on us for hiking. What they tried to say is that we didn't have a permit because there were so many of us, but we had no idea that there was going to be this many out. And so the fear manifested itself. I saw people who are trying to explore outdoors and they already have a fear of wildlife. Now we have to worry about other human beings who don't necessarily think that this is a place for us or a place to be diversified. Because Denver is not, our percent for being African American is about 2%, 2 to 5%. So typically our guides will go scout a trail to see how it feels out there. If we get the look like, hey, what are you doing here? It's like, nah, this is not a good city. We're going to go to the next one. I do know that Colorado Parks and Wildlife is definitely trying. Taisha Adams, she's actually the first African-American commissioner for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. You just look at the history on the wall. You just walk down the hall and you see poster, picture after picture after portrait after portrait. And there's no Native Americans, no Asians. Like, it's crazy. I'm like, wow, this is what Parks and Recs is made of. And so for me, it's a joy to see someone like her step into a position of action to say, here is where we change our policies, our legislative efforts. How do we work on getting the brown community, the Black community outdoors, and just really intricate into the outdoor atmosphere?
Jessica Newton, founder of Vibe Tribe Adventures, an outdoor group for Black women. Diane Regas, your great-grandmother, I believe, came and homesteaded in what is now Denver, where you grew up. Your reflections on how that group based in Denver and how certain people just don't feel welcome in the outdoors.
First of all, it's unfortunately all too common that people experience these kinds of incidents. And I love Jessica's leadership at bringing people together and getting outdoors. I think it demonstrates a couple of really important things. One is that it's not enough to just have the land and trails there. People have to feel welcome. And that requires everything from community leadership to leadership at the governmental level, to work from groups like us, frankly, because the conservation movement needs to change to address these issues of people who need to feel welcome outdoors. And so I love that work. It's absolutely fantastic. But I think to me, the core of it is that community creating that she's doing. And what we find is that centering around community, whether it's in a Black neighborhood, a Hispanic neighborhood, whether it's working with a tribe, that centering around community is where you create that power and create that welcoming atmosphere, and people really begin to sense that they own these public lands. They have a right to be there and begin to feel, really comfortable being there. Now, that's not enough. The governmental issues that she talked about are incredibly important. When I saw that video, Jessica made me think of actually a young woman named Jessica Chavez that I met in Denver. Now, if you know Denver, Montbello is a suburb. It's not a particularly wealthy area. There's not a lot of parks there. And Jessica grew up there. She's a first-generation American. And, she kind of had that feel for the outdoors and joined, an environmental leadership group for kids when she was a kid. We began to work with her and work with them in creating a new park in her neighborhood. And I wish you could go. It's designed in a way that really reflects that culture. Now that partner, that ally organization's actually housed there. And when I met Jessica, she was actually packing up her car for her first ever trip down to the Grand Canyon with friends. And that neighborhood park that she had helped design, that her voice had been at the table, had been the first step. It had been a gateway to what I hope is a lifelong trail to public lands that include the Grand Canyon and everything else.
White people often look at land as something to be developed or improved, something to own. Parks are a little bit different. They're held in common. Tell us about how, the Native Americans view land obviously very differently, not something to be shared and stewarded. We hear about seventh generation. Tell us about that conceptual difference in connection to the land. That's acquired. Yeah, tell us about that.
We have this word. Okay, I'm going to throw out a jargony word here, and the word is called epistemology. and it's an academic term, and it just simply means how we come to know what we know. So it's like knowledge, and we talk about indigenous epistemologies as or worldviews. We could say worldviews as very different than the Eurocentric worldviews that we are raised within. That views land as anthropocentric, right? Where that is human centered, that is in service to humans, that is ultimately commodified. But for and so and thus we have capitalism mediates these extractive industries that we know of, with the oil and gas industry, with mining, and the ways that we use the land to create wealth. But from an indigenous perspective, the land is a relation, and all the things on the land is our relatives. We talk about our non-human relatives. So this is a worldview that is relational, um, that that decenters humans, and it also decenters a discourse or a narrative of rights. And that's another thing about a Eurocentric worldview, in individualist democracy, quote unquote democracy like we have in the U.S. That is what we call a rights-based society. In Native societies, they are responsibility-based societies, because when you see the natural world and all the things in it as relations, as relatives, then you are then responsible to them. So that sets up an entirely different kind of way that you engage with the land.
Diane Regas, Trust for Public Land puts people at the center, which is different than some environmental organizations, which some of them are focused on saving cute furry creatures or whole ecosystems. Is Trust for Public Land anthropocentric? Is it human centered? And are the humans above more important than other members of an ecosystem?
Greg, I think that's first of all, really good question. I think there's a lot of commonality between the ideas that Dina is describing and what we're aiming for. We believe that communities need to be at the center. And if you think historically in this country about the phases of the environmental and conservation movements, we created the national parks. That's wonderful, and is work that needs to continue to conserve places. And then we had, I would probably mark it with Silent Spring, where we started to really be worried about the chemicals, and we had the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act, a lot of those pollution oriented, that was really about trying to control human behavior. And in the 80s, we kind of added to that and said, corporations also have to take responsibility. But I believe that conservation needs to shift back to more of a focus on the relationship with people. And people at the center of our work means that we're thinking about the relationship between people and land, people in close to home parks, people in faraway parks, and what that means for the community. And to me, that's the next step for conservation, is to really be bringing people and those relationships back in and recognize we are not going to solve climate change. We are not going to solve widespread species extinctions unless we really take into account people and communities.
Justin Farrell, you write about the charitable industrial complex and kind of the new Rockefeller paradigm. So, where is that paradigm? Is that human-centered? Is that kind of preserving pretty landscapes for a relative few? Explain what the charitable industrial complex is.
Yeah, I also want to connect that with what Dina and Diane were saying too. And I think with this, the charitable industrial complex, as I describe it, is built upon some of the myths, especially that Dina was mentioning, in how we see nature and how we use nature, and to Dina's earlier point about indigenous people being locked in time. And oftentimes the preservation of nature, especially in the area that I wrote about, it works differently in different areas, which we can talk about that. But out in especially in Wyoming in the West, around Yellowstone, Grand Teton National Park, the idea of nature and the idea of giving money and engaging in, giving your time and philanthropy to protect nature is through this elite sort of white lens, that can be based on, this romanticized view of nature, and a nature that, for example, for Yellowstone, had to remove certain people to create that Eden and to create that mentality and that romantic idea that is still kind of beneath some of the organizations who work in these areas. But the charitable industrial complex I refer to just as this short-term phrase in this area that describes, how folks give their money, who they give their money to, and oftentimes it goes to these issues that are serving themselves or serving their view shed, or improving, in some instances, improving their property value. And in the community of Jackson in Teton County, it's the wealthiest county per capita in the nation, but also has the largest gap between the rich and the poor there. And so you do have a lot of social problems. You have some homelessness in the schools, and there are a lot of issues that need attention. And the money, as I show in one of the chapters of the book, is not going to any of those social services organizations who really need it. Most of it is going to environmental and arts organizations who have, tens of millions of dollars in the coffers. Meanwhile, the people who, work for the wealthy who are there to enjoy this idea of nature are struggling, working 2 to 3 jobs. And so highlighting that disconnect between caring for the people and, to Diane's point, what do we want our communities to look like? And ones that are more democratic, or the ones that are shaped by a wealthy few. And so that's all kind of part of this makeup in the community, and philanthropy plays a huge role in that, and also does a lot of good in the community. But I kind of highlight some areas where folks are more concerned about environmental issues that serve themselves or serve their elite experience of nature, rather than a more holistic approach.
Yeah, you're right.
Greg, if I could just jump in a second on that, because I think it's a really complex point, and one that's worth giving a lot of thought to. I mean, I would agree that people who've got wealth can and should do more, but I don't want to lose sight of the reality that access to nature is actually essential for all humans. And if you look at the data, they show absolutely clearly a couple of things. One is having access to nature has a bigger impact on health the lower income people are. So if you're high income and you've got, all the other needs of life and a lot of the wants, access to nature actually does help your health. But if you're at a lower income, it helps your health more. So we believe that access to nature is essential, and don't want to lose sight of that. The other thing is, and I found this statistic quite shocking when I first came to the Trust for Public Land, when I learned that 100 million people in this country, and that's 28 million kids, do not have a park close to home, do not have a green space close to home that they can access. And at the Trust for Public Land, we're actually about closing that gap, because we know we all need access to nature. I think it's needed to solve the big problems facing the world, as well as to address the public health and community issues that we see now more than ever. I think the COVID pandemic is highlighting how important it is for people to have a place to get outdoors close to home.
Right. So people cooped up, just some sort of access to nature, which again is connected to class and privilege. Diane Regas, you've also written about how public spaces and public parks have been used as gathering spaces. You put out a statement about Lafayette Square in front of the White House and noted it's been used as an encampment for soldiers, the sites of duels, the longest running anti-war protests in the U.S., as well as a slave market and a zoo. That was new to me. And our parks are public forums where we can gather, celebrate, protest, and mourn. So talk to us about the importance of public spaces, especially now.
If you think about what has happened in our lifetimes and where people go when they're feeling a need to gather, when they're responding to challenges facing our country, we go to public spaces. I lived in Washington after 9/11, and I know we all flocked to public spaces to gather and mourn. But that's true at big historic events. It's also true in communities when you get together for a picnic at a social distance now, or a community comes together for a market or a parade or a community meeting to really imagine and create what they want their community to look like. Oftentimes it's in parks and public spaces. So public spaces play such enormously important roles. They help define culture. They help define community and create community. So we that's why we put community at the center, and we think it's so important to look at the data and make sure that everybody is actually getting access to these spaces.
Justin Farrell makes me think about, first of all, it made me think about when Jerry Garcia died. I went to Strawberry Fields in Central Park. That was a tragic moment in my life. You had public
was for me too.
That was a big day.
It was a big day.
I was in Golden Gate Park that day.
Oh, that was
for the big funeral.
For Jerry Day, yeah. Justin Farrell makes me think also about the community in Jackson Hole, where these ultra wealthy people like to be amongst themselves in their gated communities, but they also like to go down to the local bar and think of themselves as an average person. And you write about how they're trying to recapture something that they've lost in their accumulation and chase of wealth. They fancy themselves as being accessible and relatable and not pretentious. Tell us about some of those inner conflicts that you found in these people.
Yeah, this was fascinating, and that was that dichotomy between this privatized elite access to nature, kind of the opposite of what Diane was talking about, and everybody needs that. But they had their own kind of enclaves, whether it was a private club or a gated community and so forth. But then there was this whole other side about trying to overcome or wrestle with or respond to the social stigma of being rich, and the extent that they would go to prove to themselves or prove to others that money hadn't turned them into these out of touch monsters. And so interestingly, I found to solve some of these dilemmas that they use this combination of rural people, or this romantic idea about rural people, as a vehicle for transformation. And so they're able to create these new versions of themselves that are more in tune with nature, but that are also more authentic, more community minded. And again, it was based on this romanticized ideal of rural people and poverty. And some of that was the called the noble Native American locked in time, or the noble cowboy also locked in time. And that was sort of their lens to see some of this. And so, for example, I tell the story in the book about a guy named John who was an oil and gas CEO, has made tens of millions of dollars. But since moving to Wyoming, he became passionate about becoming what he called a normal person. And so he wears Wrangler jeans and cowboy boots, and told me story after story of all his normal working class friends. And so what was interesting to me was the way that is tied into the experience of the natural environment. And it was a way for them to kind of leave their gated community and become more authentic and sort of experience the Western way of life that is more hard scrabble, that might be more authentic, that might be more cohesive in terms of the community, and then return, into their homes. And so, again, I don't see those as separate from the way that they engage with the natural environment, at least in that area. And this is an area where 97% of the land is already federally owned and protected. And so it's very different than some other areas we might be talking about.
That's the whole. The whole is the publicly or privately owned land in that the vast publicly owned land. We're talking about class, conservation, and climate at Climate One with Justin Farrell, professor at Yale, Dina Giglio Whitaker, lecturer in American Studies at California State University, San Marcos, and Diane Regas, CEO of the Trust for Public Land. We're going to go to our lightning round and ask true or false and some association questions. So just one word, true or false. First with Dina Giglio Whitaker. The original sin of the United States was enslavement of Black people. True or false?
False, false, false.
Diane Regas, of the 25 members of the Trust for Public Land National Board, one is a person of color.
False.
Okay.
More than one.
More than one? Okay.
I will say we have, we do look at the data about who we serve, who's on our staff, and who's on our board, because the why of our work is to serve everyone. And the issue of having community voices, people we serve, diversity on our board is one that we're wrestling with right now. And we absolutely need to increase that diversity. We also look at who we serve, and over half of the people served by our work in the last few years are in communities, predominantly communities of color. So we have a lot of work to do. So even though I said false, I don't want to falsely leave the idea that we don't have work to do, because we do.
Can I qualify my answer too?
Sure.
I'll make it really quick. America's original sin, the slavery was America's second original sin. The first original sin was invasion, genocide, and land theft, which created the conditions for the transatlantic slave trade as we know it.
Right. So you hear a lot lately about, slavery as original sin. There was another one before that. True or false, Justin Farrell, fundraisers at Yale are concerned your book might alienate current or potential donors.
True.
Dina Julia Whitaker, true or false, racism begins as religious supremacy.
It does for American Indians, yes.
Also for Dina, true or false, California legislators consulted American Indians when drafting various bills requiring ethnic studies in high school and California state universities.
False.
Association, just the first thing that comes to your mind when I mention a person, place, or thing, unfiltered with reckless abandon. Diane Regas, what's the first thing that comes to mind when I say Secretary of Interior David Bernhardt?
Bear's ears is what first comes to mind.
Thinking bear's ears. Dina Julia Whitaker, the doctrine of discovery.
Oppression.
Also for Dina, hashtag land back.
What comes to mind? Yes.
That's look it up. Hashtag land back.
Yes.
Diane Regas, what comes to mind? Barbecuing while black.
Spicy.
There was a story in Oakland, California, where someone called the cops on some black people barbecuing in a public park. So then a whole bunch of people went and barbecued. Maybe not remember that, but it was a big deal in the Bay Area where someone called 911 on some black people barbecuing in a public park.
Yeah, and I'm going to just jump in with a few more words on this. It's super important for us to recognize that these events happen, and I wouldn't call them microaggressions, right? These are a layer and layer and layer of racism in our country, and it's systematic, and people live with it. And we have to change it. The conservation community has to change. Absolutely. I also want to say that Black culture, Hispanic culture, Indigenous people's culture is joyful and wonderful, and there's a danger in overemphasizing that some people aren't welcome. It is so. I'm not taking away anything from these really painful events, but we need to work to make sure that everyone is welcome and safe in our public spaces. And if you'll indulge me, I just am thinking about in Wenatchee, Washington, where all our cherries are grown. If you've had cherries in the last couple of weeks, you probably tasted cherries picked by people we work with in Wenatchee. And they had
That's my tribal homeland.
Oh, is that right? Well,
Colville land.
What's the tribe?
Colville Confederated Tribe. So Wenatchee is one of the 12 bands of the Colville Confederation.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. As I'm sitting here, I'm on Ohlone land, so I really recognize that tribal history and present. I don't mean history as ended, but history in terms of the ongoing presence. In Wenatchee, the people who pick our cherries are immigrants to this country from usually Mexico and South America. And a lot of those folks did not feel like they were welcome in their own public spaces, and engaged with us, with other partners, to create a park that captured their culture. And it made a big difference to the city, to who's involved in decision making. And it's not over, because Dina, I think your point is, you know, bringing all of the voices to the table, recognizing the sovereignty of tribes, recognizing the importance of returning some of those lands is absolutely essential. But the civic engagement that we see around parks is incredibly inspiring and empowering for people who don't have that power in our country now.
Justin Farrell, we have a question from YouTube. Where does Ted Turner and his 2 million acres of land holdings fit into this discussion of billionaire wilderness? One time, I think he was the largest landowner in the country.
Yeah, it definitely fits in. I did not interview Mr. Turner, but he represents, some of the folks that I interview in the book, and especially in one chapter where I write about this quote unquote new Rockefeller paradigm and the vision of conservation among some of these folks. And I can't speak for Ted, but the ones that I interviewed, viewing conservation alone as buying large tracts of land and putting them either under easement or conserving them in private hands, which is very different than, Rockefeller, who donated, and now we have Grand Teton National Park. And so he definitely fits in there, but I get asked about him a lot, and he's one story among many. And I think some of the folks that I interview have less of a connection to the land and maybe to the history or to the wildlife than even Ted does. They more just kind of fly in and fly out. And so that's one kind of main difference, but that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Ina Julia Whitaker, your next book is about how Indigenous knowledge can help address climate change. Let's talk about climate and what keys Indigenous people may hold, because clearly white people haven't been such good stewards of the land, to say the least.
Well, it goes back to that word that I used before, epistemology and worldview. And in my view, climate change, and not just climate change, but really the world that we live in that has led to this state of profound environmental degradation is the result of, and is a problem of, not just science, not just capitalism even. Well, capitalism is a huge problem. It's part of it, but it's a problem of philosophy. So it and that worldview and that orientation that we have to the world, if we inhabit an orientation to the world that just results in this extractive relationship to the earth, then that's going to just keep perpetuating these environmental problems that we keep intensifying. But if we change the way that we relate to the world, if we understand the land and the ecosystems and the fundamental limitations of them, and learn to respect those limits and our relations within them, then it changes the kinds of decisions that we make about how we use the land. So I think that's really the keys of Indigenous knowledge, because as Indigenous peoples, when you live on the land and for thousands and thousands of years, as our ancestors did, that is the very definition of sustainability. Land tenure and longevity on land without having destroyed your environment means that you fundamentally understand what sustainability is and you live it. So that's why in this country, Indigenous people need to be listened to. We need to be paid attention to, and engaged at all levels of decision making.
Diane Regas, let's talk a little bit about land use post-COVID. There's a huge housing shortage a lot of places. Maybe that'll change as people move away from urban centers and they can do their job remotely. But that's affordability crisis in a lot of not just U.S. cities around the world, and that a lot of that gets to some of that is conserving land where housing can't be built. So how do you see coming out of COVID? If people are going to moving away from the coast, moving away from urban areas, that's going to put some development pressure on less populated areas. How do you see that playing out?
It's interesting. There was already pressure on some of the more small to mid-sized cities. I think about Bozeman, Montana, or Gunnison, Colorado, places that are beautiful, have access to public land and trails. People are able to work more remotely, and of course, that's been accelerated under COVID. I think that commitment to equity, that we need the conservation and environmental movement to deeply build into everything we do, brings a new set of challenges. And especially these issues, the issues of housing, which you need a piece of land to build a house on. You need a piece of land to build an apartment on. You need a piece of land to live on. And I think there are some good examples around the country of how to begin to navigate that. And in Gunnison, which I mentioned, we were able to help with a land swap that created some trails and access for people, but also ended up with a big contribution of millions of dollars to create hundreds of units of housing in nearby in the Gunnison area. Same thing in Bozeman, Montana, where someone had evicted low-income housing, low-income people from their homes to do a new big development that went bankrupt. We were given the piece of land to build a central park for Bozeman, which is a wonderful thing to do and engage lots and lots of hundreds and thousands of people in what that should look like. But there's a responsibility there to think about what about that housing shortage. And so there's interesting new solutions. Like in that case, we carved off a few acres to create housing in addition to having the central park. So I think that there's what I'm seeing is more and more partnerships that cross some of these traditional issue lines, like an environmental group or a conservation group also cares about housing, also cares about equity, also cares about public engagement voting. And we can get to that by really thoughtful partnerships with local communities, with whether it's a rural community, whether it's an urban community, whether it's a small city or town. If you've ever gone for a vacation in a small town, a lot of times there's nowhere to get outside. And so there are these issues that we're grappling with, whether it's housing, whether it's equity, whether it's access to the outdoors. They show up differently in every community in our country, and we need to be very flexible and bring in allies to work on them.
And Justin, a cynical interpretation of your work is that we shouldn't rely on philanthropists to solve those problems because their charitable dollars are going to go things that serve their own ego and social interests and some of their emotional needs, and they're not going to solve the hard problems of poor housing and the other things that Diane just mentioned. Is that fair?
I do think that's fair, but I also think that this is one example, and an example that I think is playing out, in a place like Bozeman, in a place like Reno, Boise, Denver, all these places. But I don't want to lose sight that philanthropy also does immense good, humanitarian good, cultural good, environmental good. But that doesn't mean we can't look at the full story and understand, places like Jackson and places across the West, really, where there is an over-reliance on affluent philanthropy and to save these communities. And I do think that that's a myth that needs to be overcome, despite all the genuine ultra-wealthy people and genuine organizations doing good work. I think it can certainly help, but it at times can be just a Band-Aid solution when we need much larger structural change. And to your point about COVID, I do think looking down the road, there are some questions about, is this an opportunity to rethink from the ground up how we want to structure our economy, how we want to structure our communities, our relationship with the natural environment, and that remains to be seen. I remain somewhat optimistic, and my lab is fielding a survey in the rural West, representative of all 11 Western states, and we're asking rural Westerners whether or not they will support, more federal spending in the wake of the pandemic, their environmental views, and all of these things. So we should have some results about whether or not the pandemic has yielded any sort of support for these sorts of programs.
Right, lot to be seen, like how we relate, allow those parklets to stay in streets, redistribute power between pedestrians and cars in cities, and all sorts of things. Justin Farrell, you testified before Congress about dark funding of climate misinformation and the connection with philanthropy. So there's sort of a dark side. I'm curious if any of the people you interviewed are, funding climate denial organizations while preserving the, trout streams in Wyoming, but funding climate denialism. Do you get into any of that?
Yeah, I would say I'm sure there is overlap within those networks, because a lot of it runs within some of these conservative think tanks that do all sorts of work, not just climate denial. And actually, most of that has went underground in recent years. So during the 90s and early 2000s, you had Exxon funding a lot of these groups, or even creating imitation environmental groups to disparage the facts on climate change and to spread misinformation. And so that testimony before the Senate committee was about that process, and that the history of fossil fuel companies and their allies to essentially confuse the American public on climate change. And so, there's some commonalities between my new book and that, but that's the fossil fuel funding of climate denial is much more nefarious, much less complex in its motivations. And whereas in this book, there are a lot of really interesting ironies and complexities, and there's a lot of goodwill even that just kind of falls flat sometimes. Whereas in climate denial, it was they had the mission and they mostly accomplished it.
Dina Julia Whitaker, you live on the California coast, where the term managed retreat is sometimes used. You say that's rich people's territory. There's a lot of wealthy coastal property that's at risk. How do you see that playing out?
Well, the way I see it playing out is that sea level rise doesn't discriminate, and so on these coastal properties that are by and large owned by wealthy people who will not be able to get flood insurance, who cannot get flood insurance. They are facing massive amounts of stranded assets, which means that as we play that game, as we talked about before, that game of musical chairs, somebody eventually the music's going to stop, and they're going to be holding property that is, for all intents and purposes, is worthless because it's going to be underwater. So the state has taken that approach. The state of California considers a crisis now, and that's how they're dealing with it. And the fights around armoring and managed retreats are heating up, and at the same time, it's also raising these questions about access and how do we protect access to public spaces, to the coast, for public people, or people in the public, and people who come from disadvantaged communities that don't have easy access to the coast. And so this is the work of the Coastal Commission, some of the great recent work of the Coastal Commission that I applaud. And having done this work of creating an environmental justice policy and engaging tribes. And I wanted to mention too, Greg, you talked about the Kashaya, or was it Diane, you talked about the Kashaya Pomo. There's a film out right now that's been running on PBS stations, and I don't know the exact name of it, but it was produced by Thomas Rigler and in conjunction with the Coastal Commission about the California coast, that gives a beautiful overview of the history of the California coast and the very unique the Coastal Act and the creation of the Coastal Commission, which is about protecting the environments and public access. So I would really recommend that. They highlight that Kashaya story quite beautifully in that film.
Oh, thank you. It's a beautiful. It's a really encouraging story. Right now we're facing such enormous challenges at all levels in our country. With COVID, and COVID particularly hitting Black and Brown people harder, with the death rates that are twice what they are for white people. And
the worst for American Indians than anyone.
And the I was going to say the tribal areas, especially the Navajo, are being hit unbelievably hard, and that's just one of the layers of challenges that I think we as a country are facing. And the story of the Kashaya, the story of people taking ownership of their communities across this country, really beginning to chip away at some of the inequities that exist, some of the 100 million people who don't have access to a park, which is what we're focused on, or some of the other issues, to me gives me optimism that we will make it through this incredibly difficult time. And as Justin said, it's a chance to really think about how we want to rebuild our communities, how to rebuild communities in an equitable and inclusive way, and how to do it in a way that really empowers people whose voices have not been at the table, and put in place policies from the community to the state and federal level that emphasizes that as we go forward.
As we wrap up, I want to ask each of you to note a bright spot that you see, because there is so much pain and racial pain, COVID pandemic. It's heavy, a lot going on right now. And Diane Regas, I think of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is a pretty big, recent bipartisan win. So tell us, what's the significance of that? What is it, and what's the significance of it?
Land and Water Conservation Fund is the federal fund that's funded. It doesn't directly cost the taxpayers. It's funded from oil and gas revenues. And it has been used to help accomplish some of the conservation, some of the access to trails and parks that I've talked about. Historically, we've had to fight every single year for that to be funded. And the Senate just passed, and we are hopeful that the House will pass an agreement to fund it in perpetuity at about twice the level that it's been funded. And so to me, that's very encouraging. The other bright spot I can't resist mentioning is, I see the young people who are currently engaged on issues of racism, on issues of environment and climate, on issues of building their communities. And they're so much smarter and wiser than I was at their age. It just gives me a lot of hope that with all of the challenges that we're leaving them, they are stepping up, and I love seeing that.
Dina Julia Whitaker, bright spots you see.
I'm with you, Diane, about that with the youth, because I, as a college professor and working with the youth, that's who I place my faith in, and I was nowhere near as savvy as they are at that age. And I'm also really encouraged by what some people see as civil unrest and these ethnic uprisings is for me exciting, because finally we're starting to have some truth be told, and the toppling of these monuments to oppression is a hopeful sign for me. I love that we can get rid of Columbus and Junipero Serra and John Sutter and all the other symbols of colonization for indigenous people. It's not just Confederate monuments that are a problem. So that gives me hope.
Justin Farrell, what gives you hope, bright spot as we end here?
My students, certainly, so I would echo that. But I think, looking at the landscape and kind of even in just the last few months, there's more of an emphasis on systemic racism, on economic justice as a systems issue, which I say that because I think people aren't getting caught up as much as becoming bitter at rich individual people, or becoming bitter at individual moral failings of the rich, but looking instead, what policies can we create to alleviate these problems? And I do think there's been a shift toward that systems thinking. rather than just focusing on, Ted Turner or whoever, whatever rich person you want to name. And so we're not losing our way by fixating so much on these individual failings, but focusing again on these policies at the systems level, which I think is a good way forward.
We've been talking about race, class, and land conservation in the American West. Ultra wealthy people are taking up land conservation in Jackson, Wyoming, and elsewhere, where they fly in on their private jets and gather in gated communities nested in protected natural lands. For regular people, the Trust for Public Land and other groups envision every American being 10 minutes away from a park. And let's not forget that land originally probably was stolen from Native Americans. Justin Farrell is Associate Professor of Sociology at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and author of Billionaire Wilderness, the Ultra Wealthy and the Remaking of the American West. Dina Gilia Whitaker is Lecturer in American Indian Studies at California State University, San Marcos. Her book is As Long as Grass Grows, The Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. Diane Regas, President and CEO of the Trust for Public Land. She previously served as a high-ranking official at the US EPA. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Please give us a rating or tell a friend. It really does help advance the conversation about all dimensions of the climate challenge. I'm Greg Dalton. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Greg.
Well.